Some people believe a uniform tells them everything they need to know about a person. The words cut through the glittering ballroom just as softly as the jazz drifting beneath the crystal chandeliers, yet they carried the weight of a judgment that had been repeated for generations. High above the Manhattan skyline, where walls of glass reflected a sea of city lights stretching for miles, the Sterling family celebrated another year of extraordinary success. Waiters moved gracefully between tables dressed in white linen. Polished silver sparkled beneath warm golden light, and conversations floated effortlessly from billion-dollar investments to vacation homes along the coast of Italy. It was the kind of evening where every smile looked expensive and every handshake promised another fortune. At the center of it all stood Jonathan Sterling, 42 years old, respected by financial magazines as one of the country's most influential business leaders. Confidence followed him the way shadows followed sunlight. Every guest wanted a moment of his attention, and every employee understood the unspoken rules of staying invisible unless called upon. Danielle Carter understood those rules better than anyone. Wearing a spotless black and white waitress uniform with a neatly pressed apron tied carefully around her waist, she carried a silver tray through the ballroom with calm precision, quietly refilling glasses before anyone realized they were empty. She never interrupted conversations. She never hurried. She simply observed the room with thoughtful eyes that seemed to notice details everyone else overlooked. Most guests barely looked at her face. They noticed only the tray in her hands, the apron around her waist, and the name badge pinned neatly above her heart. That was enough for them to decide exactly who she was. As Danielle approached the Sterling family's private table carrying fresh, sparkling water, Jonathan's younger sister glanced at her shoes before letting out a quiet laugh that quickly caught the attention of everyone seated nearby. "Be careful," she said loudly enough for surrounding tables to hear. "That tray probably costs more than everything she owns." A ripple of amused laughter spread across the family. Another relative smiled and added, "People like her must dream about sitting at tables like this instead of serving them." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one spoke. The music continued. Glasses clinked softly. Somewhere beyond the windows, helicopters crossed the night sky above Manhattan, completely unaware that one careless conversation was quietly changing the direction of several lives. Jonathan looked toward Danielle. For a brief moment, he could have ended the comments with a single sentence. Instead, he offered nothing more than a polite smile and returned to discussing an upcoming board meeting. His silence sounded louder than the laughter surrounding him. Danielle remained perfectly composed. Without the slightest change in expression, she poured sparkling water into each crystal glass with steady hands before thanking the family in a warm, professional voice. She neither defended herself nor reacted to the insults hanging in the air. Her quiet dignity confused one elderly guest seated nearby, who watched her carefully as though sensing there was something unusual about the young woman everyone else had dismissed so easily. As Danielle stepped away from the table, a gentle vibration came from the phone resting discreetly inside her apron pocket. She felt it immediately but did not reach for it. A second vibration followed only moments later. Then a third. Whatever message waited on the screen seemed urgent enough to arrive again and again, yet she continued serving guests with the same calm professionalism she had shown all evening. She smiled politely while collecting empty glasses, thanked another guest for moving a chair, and carried a fresh tray toward the ballroom without allowing a single distraction to interrupt her work. No one noticed the phone. No one wondered why it refused to stop vibrating. They were far too busy believing they already understood the woman wearing the apron. None of them imagined that before the evening ended, the smallest notification on that silent phone would become the most powerful conversation in the entire room. Danielle continued moving through the ballroom as though nothing unusual had happened. The silver tray rested effortlessly in her hands while she thanked guests for their patience, replaced empty glasses, and adjusted folded linen napkins with the quiet precision that came from years of practice. If the careless remarks from the Sterling family had wounded her, there was no trace of it in her expression. She had learned long ago that dignity often spoke most clearly through restraint. Around her, conversations resumed with effortless confidence. Venture capitalists debated artificial intelligence. Real estate developers discussed luxury projects stretching along the Florida coastline. Investment bankers celebrated another quarter of record profits. Every table overflowed with certainty, success, and carefully rehearsed optimism. Danielle listened only enough to anticipate what each guest might need before they asked. She understood that remarkable service was often invisible. The best moments happen when people never realize someone had quietly made their evening easier. As she reached the service station tucked discreetly behind a decorative wall of fresh orchids, the gentle vibration returned inside the pocket of her neatly pressed apron. This time it lasted slightly longer. Danielle carefully placed the tray onto the polished counter before finally removing her phone. The screen displayed several unread messages from the same contact. Harrison Legal Group. Beneath them appeared a missed call, followed by another incoming call arriving at that exact moment. Danielle looked toward the ballroom entrance where other servers continued moving confidently between the tables. Everything remained under control. She answered softly, "Good evening." The familiar voice on the other end spoke with measured professionalism. "Miss Carter, I apologize for calling repeatedly, but we needed to confirm you received the final documents." Danielle stepped quietly into the empty hallway beside the service area, where the sounds of conversation became pleasantly distant beneath the soft jazz music still echoing through hidden speakers. "I have not been able to look at my phone," she replied calmly. "I am still working." "Of course," the attorney answered. "We simply wanted to inform you that every remaining signature has been completed. The transaction is progressing exactly as scheduled. We will contact you again shortly." Danielle closed her eyes for one thoughtful second before smiling almost imperceptibly. "Thank you," she said. "Please continue as planned." She ended the call, placed the phone back inside her apron pocket, and returned immediately to the ballroom carrying another tray of sparkling water as though she had merely stepped away to retrieve additional glasses. No one noticed her brief absence. No one imagined that one of the most significant business transactions of the year had just moved one step closer to completion while she quietly resumed serving dinner. At the Sterling family's table, Jonathan remained focused on a conversation with members of his executive team. Charts displayed across a nearby presentation screen outlined ambitious expansion plans, projected acquisitions, and optimistic forecasts extending several years into the future. His younger sister laughed as she admired the company's rising valuation, confidently remarking that Sterling Global had become too powerful for anyone to challenge. Several relatives nodded in complete agreement. Danielle approached with fresh coffee, carefully placing each cup exactly where it belonged. Jonathan thanked her absent-mindedly, without looking up from the financial discussion. His attention remained fixed on projected growth, unaware that the future he described was already beginning to change beyond the walls of the ballroom. As Danielle stepped away once more, the elderly guest who had quietly observed her earlier caught her attention with a gentle smile. "Young lady," he said kindly, "you carry yourself as though you belong in every room you enter." Danielle paused only long enough to return the smile. "Everyone belongs somewhere," she answered softly. "Sometimes people simply need a little more time to recognize it." The elderly man watched her disappear into the crowd of elegantly dressed guests, sensing there was far more behind those quiet words than anyone else in the ballroom had yet begun to understand. The evening unfolded with the polished elegance only extraordinary wealth could afford, yet beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers another story quietly advanced, unseen by everyone who believed they already understood the room. Jonathan Sterling stood near the center of the ballroom beside an enormous digital display showcasing Sterling Global's latest achievements. Investors applauded projected revenue growth, board members exchanged confident smiles, and members of the Sterling family spoke as though the future had already signed an exclusive agreement with their last name. Jonathan raised a glass to thank everyone for believing in the company's vision. "The next decade belongs to those who refuse to think small," he declared confidently. Applause filled the ballroom. His younger brother smiled proudly before adding, "And fortunately, nobody is in a position to stop us." Laughter spread across several tables as guests lifted their glasses in celebration. Danielle Carter quietly stepped between them carrying a polished silver tray filled with fresh coffee and warm dessert plates. She moved with the same steady professionalism that had defined her entire evening, carefully placing each cup exactly where it belonged without interrupting the speeches. Her phone remained silent for the moment, resting inside the pocket of her neatly pressed apron, while the final stages of a transaction worth billions continued unfolding far beyond the ballroom walls. Jonathan never noticed her. Neither did most of his relatives. To them, she remained another member of the service staff whose presence mattered only when a glass became empty or a plate needed replacing. As Danielle reached the end of the table, Jonathan's younger brother casually glanced toward her before speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Imagine spending your whole life serving people who built everything you could only dream about. Several guests forced polite smiles. Others looked down at their plates, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the remark. Jonathan remained focused on answering questions from investors. Once again, silence became its own decision. Danielle simply thanked the guest for making room so she could place his coffee before continuing toward the next table. Her composure puzzled the elderly gentleman who had spoken with her earlier. He watched carefully, noticing that she never reacted defensively, never hurried, and never appeared intimidated by the wealth surrounding her. It was almost as though she carried a certainty no one else could see. Across the ballroom, a senior financial analyst quietly approached Jonathan with a tablet displaying fresh market updates. "Everything still looks stable," he whispered. "There has been unusual activity involving institutional shares today, but nothing that should concern the board this evening." Jonathan nodded without much interest. Large companies experienced market activity every day. Tonight was for celebration, not investigation. The analyst stepped away, unaware that the information he had dismissed represented only a tiny fragment of a far larger picture still hidden beneath layers of confidential agreements. Danielle collected another empty tray and passed beneath enormous windows overlooking Manhattan, where countless lights shimmered against the dark sky like stars scattered across the city below. For just a moment, she allowed herself to look outside. Years earlier, she had stood on those same streets wondering whether hard work alone could ever overcome circumstances. Tonight, she carried the same quiet determination, although almost nothing about her life remained the same. A familiar vibration suddenly returned inside her apron pocket. She glanced discreetly at the screen while standing behind a decorative column. A single message appeared from Harrison Legal Group. "Board representatives have arrived. Awaiting your authorization." Danielle looked toward the ballroom, where the Sterling family continued celebrating a future they believed belonged entirely to them. Then she calmly locked her phone without replying, lifted the silver tray once more, and walked back into the room with the same composed smile she had worn since the beginning of the evening. No one noticed that the most powerful decision of the night was still waiting for a single quiet response from the woman they continued calling only the waitress. Danielle carried the tray through the ballroom with the same quiet confidence that had become almost invisible to everyone around her. Crystal glasses reflected the golden light overhead, while conversations drifted effortlessly from private equity to luxury resorts and international expansion. The Sterling family remained at the center of every discussion, surrounded by executives eager to congratulate Jonathan on another remarkable year. They spoke about acquisitions still waiting to happen, competitors that could never catch them, and a future they believed was entirely under their control. Danielle listened only enough to anticipate who needed fresh coffee and whose water glass was nearly empty. Years of serving had taught her that careful observation revealed far more than constant conversation ever could. As she reached the Sterling table once again, Jonathan's sister glanced toward the neatly pressed apron around Danielle's waist before smiling with unmistakable superiority. "I cannot imagine spending every evening cleaning up after other people," she said as several relatives laughed softly. "There must come a point when you simply accept that some lives are meant to serve while others are meant to lead." Jonathan remained focused on a discussion with two board members reviewing next quarter's projections. He heard the comment. He heard the laughter. Once again, he allowed silence to answer in his place. Danielle simply placed a fresh dessert plate in front of each guest with steady hands and thanked them for making room at the table. Not a single movement suggested embarrassment. Not a single expression hinted at resentment. Her composure seemed almost impossible to disturb. The elderly gentleman seated nearby watched her carefully, his curiosity growing stronger with every passing minute. There was something unusual about a person who remained so calm while standing in the middle of quiet disrespect. Just as Danielle turned toward the service station, The phone inside her apron vibrated once more. This time, she glanced briefly at the screen before stepping into the hallway beside the ballroom entrance where the music softened into a distant melody. She answered immediately. "Good evening." The familiar attorney spoke with calm precision. "Miss Carter, every regulatory approval has now been confirmed. The board representatives and banking counsel have arrived in the building. We are awaiting only your authorization before entering the ballroom." Danielle looked through the open doorway toward the celebration continuing inside. Jonathan was thanking investors for their confidence while his relatives applauded another optimistic forecast displayed across the enormous presentation screen. She allowed herself one thoughtful breath before replying. "Thank you. Please proceed according to schedule." "Very good," the attorney answered. "We will enter when instructed." Danielle ended the call, slipped the phone back into her apron pocket, and returned immediately to her duties carrying another polished tray as though nothing significant had happened. She refilled 2 glasses near the stage, adjusted a misplaced chair, and smiled warmly as she thanked a guest for attending the evening. No one suspected that the future ownership of Sterling Global had already crossed a point of no return. Near the ballroom entrance, several sharply dressed professionals quietly stepped out of an elevator carrying leather portfolios embossed with the logos of respected law firms and financial institutions. They remained outside the doors, speaking discreetly among themselves while waiting for the exact moment to enter. A hotel concierge assumed they had arrived for another private reception. Several guests noticed them through the glass, but quickly returned to their conversations without giving the group another thought. Jonathan continued discussing long-term strategy, completely unaware that the people gathering only a few yards away were not there to congratulate him. They were waiting for a single quiet signal from the woman everyone still believed was simply the waitress wearing the apron. The ballroom remained filled with effortless laughter, polished speeches, and the quiet confidence that only generations of wealth seemed able to produce. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across marble floors while a string quartet replaced the earlier jazz ensemble with elegant classical music. Every detail reflected refinement, stability, and control. Jonathan Sterling stood beside the presentation screen answering congratulations from investors who believed they were celebrating the beginning of an even greater era for Sterling Global. Around him, members of his family accepted compliments with practiced ease, speaking about expansion plans, leadership succession, and the certainty that their company would remain under Sterling control for decades to come. Danielle Carter continued serving coffee and dessert with the same measured professionalism that had quietly defined her entire evening. She thanked guests with genuine warmth, carefully removed empty plates, and straightened a misplaced chair before another server even noticed it. Nothing about her appearance suggested that the next few minutes would alter the future of everyone inside the room. Near the entrance, the hotel doors opened once again. This time the arriving guests looked different from the investors and socialites who had filled the ballroom throughout the evening. 4 professionally dressed attorneys entered together, followed by 2 senior banking executives and 3 members of an independent corporate advisory firm. Each carried a slim leather portfolio instead of a champagne glass. Their expressions were courteous but purposeful, and their measured pace immediately caught the attention of several experienced executives seated near the entrance. Quiet conversations began to fade. One board member leaned toward Jonathan and whispered, "Were you expecting legal counsel tonight?" Jonathan glanced toward the doorway and slowly shook his head. "No," he answered. "Perhaps another event in the hotel." The attorneys paused only briefly inside the ballroom before scanning the room with calm precision. They were not searching for the presentation stage. They were not looking toward the Sterling family table. They appeared to be looking for someone else entirely. Jonathan noticed the unusual behavior, but quickly returned to greeting another investor. Across the room, Danielle carefully placed fresh coffee beside the elderly gentleman who had spoken kindly to her earlier. He smiled warmly and thanked her before quietly asking, "Has your evening become any easier?" Danielle returned a gentle smile. "Sometimes the longest evenings become the most meaningful," she replied softly. Before the gentleman could answer, one of the senior attorneys finally spotted Danielle standing near the service station. He exchanged a subtle nod with his colleagues before the entire group began walking calmly across the ballroom. Their polished shoes echoed softly against the marble floor. One conversation after another slowly came to a stop as guests instinctively followed their movement. The attorneys passed directly by Jonathan without slowing. They walked beyond the investors, beyond the board members, beyond the Sterling family, until they reached Danielle. Every person nearby watched with growing confusion. Danielle calmly placed the silver tray onto a nearby service cart before folding her hands respectfully in front of her apron. The lead attorney smiled warmly. "Good evening, Miss Carter," he said with unmistakable respect. "Thank you for your patience." Danielle nodded politely. "Good evening." The attorney carefully opened his leather portfolio and removed a single document folder sealed with official signatures. "We are pleased to inform you," he said clearly enough for those closest to hear, "that every required approval has now been completed. The acquisition documents are fully executed and effective immediately." Danielle accepted the folder without the slightest hint of surprise. She simply thanked him with quiet professionalism. Around the ballroom, puzzled expressions spread from table to table. Jonathan slowly turned toward the group, sensing for the first time that the visitors had not come for another event after all. The Sterling family exchanged uncertain glances as the room grew noticeably quieter. Nobody yet understood what had just happened. They only knew that every accomplished attorney, banker, and corporate representative in the ballroom had walked past the billionaire they expected to greet and had instead addressed the woman they still believed was only the waitress wearing the apron. The silence spread through the ballroom one table at a time. Conversations stopped in the middle of sentences. Crystal glasses remained suspended halfway to waiting hands. Even the musicians seemed uncertain whether they should continue playing as every eye followed the attorneys, standing respectfully before Danielle Carter. Jonathan Sterling stepped away from the presentation stage, his confident expression gradually replaced by quiet confusion. "I believe there has been some misunderstanding," he said politely as he approached the group. "If this concerns Sterling Global, I am Jonathan Sterling." The lead attorney turned toward him with professional courtesy before offering a respectful nod. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling. We are fully aware of your identity." His calm answer only deepened the uncertainty spreading across the room. Jonathan glanced toward the document folder now resting in Danielle's hands. "Then perhaps someone could explain why your team is presenting legal documents to a member of the restaurant staff." The attorney smiled gently, not with amusement, but with the patience of someone accustomed to delivering unexpected news. "Certainly." He turned back toward Danielle. "Miss Carter, with your permission?" Danielle gave a small nod. "Please continue." The attorney carefully opened another portfolio and removed several professionally bound documents bearing the signatures of financial institutions, regulatory agencies, and independent auditors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced clearly enough for the nearest guests to hear, "the transaction concluded successfully approximately 12 minutes ago, following final regulatory confirmation. Effective immediately, ownership of Sterling Global Holdings has transferred according to the executed acquisition agreement." The words settled across the ballroom like a wave that no one could outrun. Jonathan stared at the attorney without speaking. His younger sister quietly laughed once, assuming she had misunderstood. "Transferred to whom?" she asked. The attorney looked directly toward Danielle before answering with complete confidence. "To Miss Danielle Carter, acting through Carter Horizon Capital and its affiliated investment partnership." For several long seconds, nobody moved. The enormous ballroom that had echoed with confident laughter only minutes earlier became almost impossibly still. Jonathan slowly turned toward Danielle, searching her face for some sign that this was an elaborate misunderstanding. Instead, he found the same calm expression she had carried throughout the evening while pouring water, serving dinner, and quietly enduring remarks that should never have been spoken. The elderly gentleman seated nearby lowered his eyes and smiled softly, as though a question that had puzzled him all evening had finally been answered. Jonathan's younger brother spoke first. "That cannot be possible," he whispered. "She is." His voice faded before finishing the sentence, suddenly realizing how differently those unfinished words now sounded. Danielle did not interrupt anyone. She simply opened the document folder and quietly reviewed the final confirmation page before signing one remaining acknowledgement with the same steady hand that had earlier carried polished silver trays through the ballroom. She then closed the folder and returned the pen to the attorney with a polite smile. "Thank you," she said. I appreciate the professionalism of everyone involved. The attorney accepted the documents before replying warmly. Congratulations, Chairwoman. The single word seemed to echo through the room with greater force than any speech delivered that evening. Chairwoman, not waitress, not server, not employee. Around the ballroom, executives instinctively straightened their posture while board members exchanged stunned expressions. Several investors quietly opened their phones, searching financial news services that were already beginning to report the completed acquisition. Headlines appeared one after another, each confirming the same extraordinary announcement. Jonathan looked from the news alerts back to Danielle, finally understanding that every confident prediction made during dinner had become outdated before dessert had even been served. The company he had proudly celebrated throughout the evening no longer belonged to the Sterling family. It belonged to the quiet woman wearing the neatly pressed apron who had thanked every guest with kindness while carrying the greatest secret in the entire ballroom. No one seemed to remember the music anymore. The elegant ballroom that had echoed with effortless confidence only moments earlier now stood suspended beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, as though the city itself had paused to witness what humility looked like when it finally arrived. Jonathan Sterling remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Danielle Carter. He replayed every moment of the evening in silence. The careless jokes, his family's laughter, his own decision to remain silent when respect had needed a voice. None of it could be taken back. Around the room, board members quietly refreshed financial news on their phones. Every major business publication carried the same headline confirming the completed acquisition. There was no misunderstanding left to explain away. One executive slowly approached the lead attorney and requested confirmation of the transaction details. The attorney calmly presented the official documentation, allowing the executive to verify every signature, every approval, and every regulatory filing. Within minutes, the whispers that spread through the ballroom were no longer fueled by disbelief. They were fueled by certainty. Jonathan's younger sister looked toward Danielle with visible confusion. Why? She finally asked. If you already owned everything, why continue serving dinner? Danielle looked down briefly at the neatly pressed apron tied around her waist before answering. Because I accepted a commitment, and I believe commitments should be honored. Her voice remained gentle, carrying neither pride nor resentment. My shift was not over. Several guests lowered their eyes, recognizing the quiet dignity hidden inside that simple answer. The elderly gentleman smiled warmly, as though the evening had finally revealed the lesson he sensed from the very beginning. Jonathan slowly walked toward Danielle, stopping only a few feet away. For the first time since they had met that evening, he truly looked at her instead of looking through her. You knew, he said quietly. You knew the transaction had already been completed while we were sitting at dinner. Danielle nodded once. Yes. And you still served every table. Yes. Jonathan hesitated before asking the question that now mattered far more than ownership. Why did you never tell anyone? Danielle looked around the ballroom where investors, attorneys, servers, musicians, and executives now stood together in the same silence. Because respect that appears only after power is discovered is not respect, she answered softly. It is recognition. Those are not the same thing. The words settled deeply across the room. No one argued. No one searched for another explanation. Jonathan lowered his head slightly, absorbing every sentence. Throughout his career, he had believed leadership began with authority, influence, and achievement. Danielle had quietly demonstrated that genuine leadership began much earlier, long before titles or ownership entered the conversation. One of the senior board members stepped forward respectfully. Madam Chairwoman, he said, the board is prepared to meet whenever you wish. Danielle smiled politely. The board has waited long enough this evening. Let everyone finish their dinner first. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. They had expected immediate restructuring, dramatic announcements, or sweeping decisions. Instead, they watched the company's new owner place the comfort of everyone else ahead of her own historic moment. Jonathan noticed it too. Every expectation he had formed about power continued to dissolve. Danielle thanked the attorneys, then quietly picked up the silver tray she had set aside only minutes earlier. One of the younger servers approached nervously. Miss Carter, you do not have to do that anymore. Danielle smiled warmly. Perhaps not, she replied. But someone still ordered coffee. She carried the tray toward a nearby table, serving each guest with exactly the same grace, patience, and professionalism she had shown before anyone knew who she really was. Watching her walk across the ballroom, Jonathan finally understood that the greatest difference between wealth and character was this. Wealth changed what people owned. Character remained exactly the same, even after everything else changed. The atmosphere inside the ballroom no longer belonged to celebration. It belonged to reflection. Guests who had spent the evening discussing influence and achievement now found themselves quietly questioning how easily they had overlooked the person standing beside them. Crystal chandeliers still illuminated the room with the same warm elegance. The city skyline still glittered beyond the towering windows, and the orchestra continued playing gentle classical music, yet everything felt different because the people inside the room had changed. Danielle Carter carefully returned the empty coffee cups to her silver tray with the same calm attention she had shown from the beginning of the evening. Nothing about her movements suggested triumph. She did not hurry toward the stage. She did not gather the attorneys around her for dramatic announcements. She simply completed the final moments of the commitment she had accepted before the evening began. Several executives watched in complete disbelief. One quietly whispered, "She still thinks like someone serving other people." The elderly gentleman who had observed Danielle throughout the evening smiled gently before replying, "No. She thinks like someone who respects every responsibility she accepts." His words spread quietly among those standing nearby. Jonathan Sterling remained thoughtful as he watched Danielle thank another guest for attending the gala. The contrast unsettled him. If their positions had been reversed, he wondered whether he would have shown the same grace. He already knew the answer. The lead attorney approached Danielle once more. "Madam Chairwoman," he said respectfully, "the media has begun requesting official statements. The board members are also asking whether you would like to address everyone before they leave." Danielle looked across the ballroom at the restaurant staff still clearing tables, the musicians carefully packing away instruments, and the guests who remained uncertain whether to stay or quietly depart. After a brief moment, she nodded. "Very well," she replied. "Only for a few minutes." The attorney invited everyone to gather near the presentation stage. Conversations gradually faded as investors, executives, board members, and members of the Sterling family assembled together. Jonathan quietly stepped aside, no longer standing at the center where he had delivered his confident speech earlier that evening. Danielle walked toward the stage wearing exactly the same neatly pressed waitress uniform and apron she had worn while serving dinner. She carried no prepared notes. She needed none. Looking across the room, she saw people who had admired success, people who had protected tradition, people who had remained silent, and people who had quietly shown kindness. "Good evening," she began softly. "Tonight has been unforgettable for many reasons. Some of you met me only as the waitress serving your dinner. Some of you spoke kindly to me. Some of you did not. I do not mention that to embarrass anyone. I mention it because every one of us deserves to remember how quickly appearances can become mistaken for truth." The ballroom remained completely silent. Danielle continued with the same calm sincerity. "This company was never purchased to prove that one person is greater than another. It was purchased because I believe every organization becomes stronger when talent, effort, and character are recognized before titles and appearances. Effective immediately, no employee will lose a position because of this acquisition. No department will be dismantled simply to make a statement. The only change I expect is that every person who walks through our doors, whether they wear a tailored suit or a service apron, will be treated with equal dignity." Several members of the restaurant staff quietly looked at one another, surprised to hear those words spoken in a room filled with some of the country's most powerful business leaders. Jonathan slowly lowered his eyes, understanding that the greatest decision Danielle had made that evening was not purchasing the company. It was choosing compassion when she possessed every opportunity to choose revenge. Around the ballroom, applause began softly from a single table before spreading steadily through the room, not as recognition of wealth or authority, but as respect for a kind of leadership that could never be measured on a balance sheet. The applause gradually faded, leaving behind a silence unlike any that had filled the ballroom earlier that evening. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty or surprise. It was the silence that followed a lesson nobody had expected to learn. One by one, Guests began collecting their coats while conversations resumed in quieter voices, no longer centered on stock prices or expansion plans, but on dignity, character, and the remarkable woman who had transformed an elegant celebration into something far more meaningful. Danielle Carter stepped away from the stage without lingering beneath the spotlight. She thanked the musicians for their performance, smiled warmly at the restaurant manager who had trusted her throughout the evening, and quietly untied the neatly pressed apron she had worn from the beginning of her shift. Folding it carefully over one arm, she treated it with the same respect she had shown every responsibility entrusted to her. Jonathan Sterling watched her from across the room before finally walking toward her with measured steps. There were no cameras surrounding them now, no reporters waiting for a dramatic statement, and no audience expecting another surprise. Only two people standing beneath soft golden lights overlooking the endless skyline of Manhattan. Jonathan stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Carter," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology that should have been offered long before anyone knew who you were." Danielle looked at him with calm attention, but did not interrupt. "I heard every word my family spoke tonight," Jonathan continued. "I also heard my own silence. Looking back, I realize silence can become agreement when someone deserves to be defended. I failed that test." Danielle nodded gently, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "Recognizing a mistake is never comfortable," she replied. "But it is where real change begins." Jonathan lowered his eyes briefly before looking back at her. "I expected power to change you tonight," he admitted. "Instead, it changed the way I see myself." Danielle offered a small smile. "Power does not create character," she said softly. "It simply reveals what was already there." Those words lingered between them as the final guests quietly departed through the ballroom doors. Nearby, members of the restaurant staff finished clearing tables, while several board members respectfully thanked each employee before leaving, a simple gesture that had been noticeably absent at the beginning of the evening. Even Jonathan's younger sister approached Danielle with visible humility. "I spoke carelessly," she said. "I judged you without knowing anything about you. I am truly sorry." Danielle accepted the apology with quiet grace. "Thank you," she answered. "I hope tonight reminds all of us that every person has a story we cannot see." Outside the towering windows, Manhattan continued to shine beneath the night sky, its millions of lights reflecting countless unseen dreams unfolding across the city. Danielle picked up the folded apron, the leather document folder, and a simple coat before walking toward the exit. She carried each item with equal care, as though none was more important than the others. Jonathan watched her leave, realizing that the most valuable lesson of his career had not come from a board meeting, a financial report, or a billion-dollar negotiation. It had come from a woman who never needed to announce her worth because her character had spoken long before her title ever did. As the ballroom lights gradually dimmed and the last guests disappeared into the elevators, one truth remained brighter than the skyline beyond the glass. Wealth can purchase influence, titles can command attention, and success can fill a room with applause, but genuine leadership begins with the simple decision to treat every person with dignity before knowing what they own, where they work, or what power they may one day hold. That night, the company changed hands, but something far more important changed hearts, proving that respect given only after greatness is revealed is already too late, because true character always deserves to be seen before the world finally recognizes it.